All right, so now we are recording. I'm going to ask everyone to please mute so we don't get any background noise. And it is my pleasure to introduce Emma and Zach, who are mycologists and co-founders of Maidenhair Mushrooms. And they are going to be leading our discussion tonight about mushroom medicine, incorporating the diverse world of fungi into the healing process. So we're so thrilled to have you both here tonight. And I'm going to kind of hand it over to you, Emma and Zach.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to be here. I'm going to get my presentation pulled up. So just let me know if you can see it. Let's see. Does that look good? Everyone see?
We can see it.
Great. Okay. So we're going to be talking about this huge, crazy world of fungus and mushrooms that has definitely, in the last couple years, has had this like ginormous boom and interest on all sorts of ways, which we'll kind of talk about. And this is like a really, really complex topic. There's a lot of different avenues within mycology. So we want to kind of keep this like open, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them as we go, or we'll have questions at the end too. Brief introductions. My name is Emma. I studied mycology at SUNY ESF. Within the mycology field, I've kind of jumped around doing some taxonomy work and agroforestry work and land management stuff. And in recent years, for the last 3 years, I've done a lot of work with specifically medicinal mushroom compounds and extracts. So that's kind of what brought me to this talk. It's a really exciting field. And Zach, if you want to.
Yeah, and I'm Zach. I studied economics and math in college, but I found my way to mushrooms, or rather they found their way to me as kind of part of my reintroduction into getting back to the land, and through a healing process of my own from dealing with some lingering issues of depression and anxiety from just life experiences, I guess. And so in recent years, I've done a lot with, I've done some mushroom consultation work with some mushroom farmers, and some helping people also kind of find themselves down a healing path in a similar way to my own, through medicinal mushrooms. And yeah.
And together, as was said, we founded Maidenhair Mushrooms, which is a group locally that encourages people to get out and explore the world of fungi we do a lot of education. We do talks like this. We teach lots of different foraging classes, mushroom hikes, ID walks, all sorts of things like that, just to get people outside and exploring nature, which has been really exciting. So we will jump right into the content. So like I said, it's really only been in recent years where there's been this huge boom in interest in specifically medicinal mushrooms in the US, but historically and worldwide, this has been a very common thing all over the world. So for example, human nature, human history has been intertwined with fungi for a long, long time. If y'all remember years ago, they found the Ötzi the Iceman in the Swiss Alps, who was dated to be around over 5,000 years old. He was actually carrying a little leather pouch with 3 different mushrooms that are now linked to be like highly medicinal mushrooms in that little pouch. There's lots and lots of evidence of indigenous peoples here in the US that used and still use fungi for all sorts of ailments, for food, for dyeing. And in Eastern medicine, fungi are central and have been for centuries now, thousands and thousands of years. So this is nothing new, even though it's feeling like, this is a new thing. So there is a difference between what we call mycophobic and mycophilic countries. Places in Asia, Eastern Europe, they're what we call mycophilic countries because It's very common in those places to, go out with your families with a basket and forage for mushrooms to eat. Medicinal mushrooms have also been a big part of the medicine there for a long time, including today. They very much embrace the fungal world, if you will, as opposed to mycophobic countries, which for a long time, that's what the US was. These are countries that have kind of turned a blind eye to the world of fungi for lots of different reasons. For example, like psilocybin, psychedelic mushrooms were kind of villainized for a long time in the US. And when when Zack and I give, mushroom walks for edible mushrooms, there's always like a lot of fear around, poisoning yourself on accident or, picking the wrong thing, which, there definitely are mushrooms out there that can harm you, but definitely doesn't warrant, fearing an entire kingdom over it. So this for a long time was a very mycophobic country. And that's definitely turning around now. And so what we see is there's actually a huge difference in the medical communities today between those two different types of countries as far as where their medical research stands when it comes to fungi. So medicinal mushrooms are actively being used in places like Korea, China, Japan, because they always kind of embraced it. And so they have tons and tons of amazing peer-reviewed research. There's lots of drugs and pharmaceuticals using mushrooms that are approved in these countries. But here in the US, that research is just kind of now starting out. The interest is just now spurring. So that research is growing. And all the stuff that we'll focus on is going to be stuff that's peer-reviewed research in the scientific community, in the medical community. But there is also lots and lots of anecdotal, thank you, research and stories out there too, which is also amazing to hear about how fungi and cancer interact. But like I said, that's anecdotal, so we're not going to really talk as much about that. So as of right now, the general consensus with a lot of the medical research in oncology with fungi is that there really isn't a lot of research on and concluding any treatment for cancer, like actually treating cancer. But there is a lot of evidence right now showing a lot of these different species of mushrooms supporting your immune response, lowering symptoms, and helping overall quality life improvement. Anything else to add? Okay, here we go. So a major roadblock in why there isn't, why it's kind of taken a long time for the US to kind of catch up in medical research is the mushroom chemistry itself. So fungi have this crazy, crazy complex chemistry that they use as their own immune system out in nature. They have chemicals that are way more complex than anything, in plants or other creatures even. And so the problem is when, a company is trying to find a new cancer drug or any kind of other drug, they really want to try to find that one compound, extract it so that they can replicate it and then test it and then put it out to the masses for use. But the problem with mushroom chemistry is that they're actually finding that it's really difficult to tease out just one singular part of the chemistry that's useful. There was a famous study that was done years ago with shiitake, which is actually a medicinal species, not just a really delicious species to eat, where they actually found that shiitake helped people with high blood pressure. And a research lab thought that they found the one substance that did that. It was a compound called lentidin. So they took that compound out, created it in the lab, and then did a bunch of studies. They gave some of just the one compound to a group with high blood pressure, and they gave another group a placebo. And the third group, they actually gave the full spectrum extract that had all of the chemical compounds from that fungus. And what they found was the single compound was just totally blown away by the full spectrum of chemicals. So it's really difficult to kind of take the medicinal compounds in these mushrooms and then put them into something,
A pill.
that can be used, but that is still being researched. And something that is interesting that I always like to say, so 60% of all drugs out there currently for cancer treatment or healing or anything in oncology comes from a natural source, like a plant, but actually none of it comes from the fungal community, any other mushroom. So obviously it's still something that needs to be explored, needs to be, researched, but there's so many possibilities. There's over 200 species of mushrooms out there right now that we know of that have medicinal compounds that have been used medicinally historically. And there's probably a lot more out there. We only truly have, they think, about 1% of the diversity of fungi known to man. So there's a lot of mushrooms that we don't even know about. So that's kind of going to be exciting to see how this field kind of expands down the line. So I'm going to go through a couple commonly used medicinal mushrooms. A lot of these are the ones that are being talked about right now. I want to reiterate that I am not a medical professional. I'm a mycologist. So with all of these things, I really encourage everyone to do your own research, talk to your doctor before trying anything. But right now, a lot of the research that has been done is also showing that there's not a lot of side effects, or really any side effects with medicinal mushrooms, which is really exciting. So the first one is probably the most well-known right now. This is turkey tail. Turkey tail has been used medically for thousands and thousands of years, especially in Asian countries where it was often put into teas in a slow simmer. This was actually the very first mushroom that the FDA did a lot of research on, specifically with cancer treatments. And what they found was that cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy, when they used turkey tail at the same time as those chemotherapy treatments, they actually helped stop the regrowth of cancer cells in those patients. And that's a concept known as complementary care, which you'll see a lot about in these studies, in that, this modern medicine, medical practices can be, kind of coupled with these more natural practices, and you actually have, both of them working and doing their jobs and like having amazing outcomes. And so those two compounds they actually found they're called PSK and PSP in turkey tail, which help to attack these cancer cells. Both of these compounds in turkey tail are approved and being used in a lot of Asian countries right now. The FDA, after all this research, even though they did find conclusive evidence, were unable to actually approve directly turkey tail because of the same reason as what I was talking about before with the chemistries. They haven't been able to conclusively pull one specific compound to be made and manufactured. And so right now, turkey tail and all of these mushrooms that we're talking about are still considered supplements under the FDA, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the FDA, just as a rule, doesn't approve any supplements for use. Another interesting thing is turkey tail is also really good generally to help alleviate pain and increase energy and stamina, which was another part of the study that was done by the FDA that they found like really exciting because, for cancer patients who are undergoing those treatments, turkey tail not only helped with fighting those cancer cells, but they also helped patients feel better overall. This is also a very, very common mushroom that you can find just out in the woods, like right out your door. Sometimes it's very prolific. It's very beautiful, depending on what it's growing on. It could be different colors. Definitely one of my favorites, and also very pretty easy one to identify if you know what to look for. So you could even go out in your own backyard and pick some and make some tea. The next mushroom is Reishi, which has a lot of names. One of them is the mushroom of immortality, Lingzi or queen mushroom. This has like been one of the most central mushrooms in Eastern medicine. It kind of like, I don't know, almost does it all. It has some amazing compounds in it that help your immune system. They help, you know, for anxiety relief. They're really good for lung health, for heart health, anti-inflammatory. It's a really beautiful mushroom. You could find them here in New York, you know, growing on hemlock trees. This is another very prominent one that's being used in research right now.
Yeah, reishi is one of, I mean, it's really one of like the most buzz friendly, I feel like, mushrooms in the mainstream today. It's getting put in kombuchas. You know, everyone knows it for its adaptogenic properties, which just it helps your body adapt to new stresses. And it's one of the most documented mushrooms throughout human history. There's paintings from China from over, you know, 2,000 years ago, where they're basically worshiping this mushroom for the health benefits of it. Even if they were purely anecdotal at that time, they had the understanding that this mushroom was very powerful medicine. It grew in abundance, and it was a great companion for the human population.
Yeah, it's a beautiful one too. Definitely one of my favorites.
Shiny.
This weird looking one is Chaga. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but it differs from the other mushrooms in that it's not technically a mushroom. When we say the word mushroom, it's the reproductive structure of the fungus, but this is not the reproductive structure like the mushrooms that you see growing. It's a store of nutrients and vitamins for the fungus itself, because this fungus grows where it gets really, really cold in the winter time in birch trees. Birch is also a medicinal tree in and of itself. And so the fungus lives in the tree and pulls nutrients and vitamins from the birch tree, makes some for itself, and it condenses it all into this little growth that's basically like the battery bank or power bank for that fungus when it's wintertime and there's no nutrients for it. But because of that, it means it's extremely nutrient dense for humans too. Something that I didn't mention that's worth mentioning is that the chemical, like the way that things move through our bodies and our immune systems is very similar to fungus. Actually, we share very similar chemical pathways within our bodies. And so these things that the fungus is making for its own immune system to protect itself, that's why it can be used also within the human body as well. So chaga is a really old, another really old, used for a long time fungus. It actually has the highest amount of antioxidants out of any other edible thing on the planet, higher than goji berries or blueberries or any of those things. So a lot of times a chunk of this one that's in my hand in the picture, you would just put it into a big pot of simmering water and it makes this gorgeous black dense tea, and you could just keep boiling the same chunk over and over again. It keeps extracting things. It's really good at helping your body fight disease. This is actually a big one that was being studied when COVID first hit, because it's antimicrobial, antibacterial, antiviral. It helps your body respond to those pathogens. And so a lot of people were trying to research chaga as an option for potentially helping COVID patients. So overall, it's really amazing at stimulating your immune system and helping you feel good and healthy. And like I said before, shiitake is also a very accessible, delicious mushroom. But not only is it delicious, it also has a lot of amazing compounds, just like these other species, to help your immune system. It's really good for blood pressure, And there's that compound lentinin that I mentioned before is actually being studied right now for HIV patients. So that ties back to, if you have an immune system that's suppressed, this is really good for, helping to be an extra aid in lifting your immune system up a bit.
Emma, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Is it okay to ask a question now? I had a couple questions come into the chat, or should we?
Absolutely.
All right. So one was sent just to me, and it was a question about, are the chemicals in the mushroom altered if they're cooked?
Oh, that's a good question. We're actually going to talk about that on this
Okay.
slide, so that will be answered. I see this other question, what is PSK and PSP? Those are what they named the two different unique compounds that they pulled, that the FDA found in turkey tail, that they found were actively cancer fighting, cancer suppressing. Both of those compounds are approved in other countries to be used for cancer treatment. Not yet in the US though. Do you know what type of compounds they are?
Yeah, they're polysaccharides. So it's polysaccharide K and polysaccharide P, as far as I know. They could have longer names on the end of what the K and P stand for, but the type of compound they are is a polysaccharide, which I believe is very similar. It binds to your fat receptors.
Yeah, good questions. I have the chat open now, so
See you, Nance.
I won't miss any more. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned before, because there aren't any approved mushroom pharmaceuticals right now, any kind of mushroom medicine that you would find on the shelves or find online is considered a supplement. The FDA does not regulate any supplements, which then causes a problem because, as we said, mushrooms are having this huge boom right now, for foraging, for food, but also for medicine. And so unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who see the fact that there's this growing interest and they kind of want to, get their foot in the door and kind of make some money maybe off of that interest. And so they might cut corners because the FDA is not going to regulate it and not a lot of people know what to look for. So they're going to pick what they see on the shelves, and not all extracts are created equal whatsoever. So we'll briefly talk about what to look for. The two biggest differences are going to be what's pictured here, what's called myceliated grain and fruiting bodies. So for those of you who aren't familiar with mushroom biology, when you see the mushrooms, like the one on the right here, growing out of a log, growing out of the ground, or packaged up in the store, this is what's known as a fruiting body. Its whole purpose is to hold spores to help the mushroom reproduce. It's similar to like an apple with the seeds inside. But the actual organism we actually don't really ever see. The whole tree, if you will, that holds the apple is known as mycelium. It's this really amazing organism. It kind of looks like this fine, white, fibrous material, almost like a spider web. It can move throughout, the soil. It can grow really big. It can live a long time. There's a lot of really amazing research, and we could talk a lot about that for a long time, but we're not going to do that. But for those who grow mushrooms inside to be used for these supplements, what they're doing is they have grain and they're going to grow that mycelium on this grain. But instead of waiting for that mycelium to produce a mushroom, they're just going to take that block, like in that picture on the left, and they're just going to process that down and put it in a pill or put it in a tea and call it and sell that to you as, a mushroom medicine or a mushroom product. And that's really cheap to do. That's really easy to do. It grows really quickly. But the problem is that mycelium in nature lives under the soil or in trees. It's usually protected. It doesn't really need a lot of chemical compounds to protect it. But when the mushroom pops out and is growing, it's exposed to a lot of, potential insects trying to eat it or the wind. And so it really creates all of those compounds that make mushrooms medicinal. for the fruiting bodies when they're out in the world and exposed. So when you process down myceliated grain, you're really not going to capture a lot of those substances. They're going to be almost all concentrated in the fruiting bodies only. And not only that, but they're using, raw grains that really are not good for your body to even really be processing. So any products that use myceliated grain can actually cause more issues with inflammation or from those grains down the line. So the FDA does encourage these makers to, on their ingredients lists, denote whether they use myceliated grain or fruiting bodies, but they still allow companies to use myceliated grain, unfortunately. So if you're looking for something on the shelves, make sure you always check, or if you're ordering something online, always check to see if it's one or the other and try to go for those fruiting bodies as much as possible.
Yeah, something else you might see is mycelial biomass, and that is more often than not also myceliated grain, at least a portion of myceliated grain. And again, just to echo what Emma said, a lot of those products are allowed to be up to 60% the grain themselves. And a lot of times it's not specified what grain was used or how it was prepared. It typically needs to be tested for cleanliness. But what you're talking about is essentially a grain that's been fermented by this mycelium for anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. So it's been cooked and then sterilized and then fermented for a period of time. And oftentimes they're just going for kind of like the cheapest grain. So it could be laden with pesticides, or maybe you already have a grain intolerance, or it's something like rye seed, which you're not going to be normally eating anyway. So they can be very problematic, and it's rather unfortunate. And there are some papers out there, some peer-reviewed papers out there that do state that myceliated grain do offer medicinal benefits, and it's hard to refute that, because what they're targeting is the enzymes that the mushrooms secrete to break down those grains to then turn them into food for the mushroom in order for the mushroom to form the fruiting body. So that enzyme is medicinal or could be medicinal, but when you take into consideration that 60% of the product that you're getting is undesirable fermented grain, it really kind of cancels each other out. And if you're gonna go for something, you really should kind of shoot for the best that you can get. And oftentimes you'll find that, especially in this region, there are a lot of really fantastic medicine makers. So you'll find that the best local ones will be using fruiting bodies. And oftentimes, if it doesn't say on the label, you can probably surmise that it will be myceliated grain. But if it's a local person, it's best to ask. I know, I don't want to drop any names or anything, but I know some medicine makers who use myceliated grain who very often hand out a very lengthy pamphlet with their products that explains why and they use myceliated grain and the benefits of. And to me, that's kind of like, if you need to sell me your product after I've already bought it from you, it's probably not ideal. And if you just look at anthropologically, humans would probably not ever be eating mycelium, maybe a little bit if it's attached to the mushroom itself. But, as kids, we've probably all eaten dirt, but I don't know very many people who go out and seek eating dirt or like leafing through the dirt to find the little white fibers to eat. So for me, I try to often frame things of like, how did people do things thousands of years ago? And for that, it's always going to be fruiting bodies.
Yeah. So then what do you turn to? in traditional Chinese medicine and a lot of Asian cultures that utilized and still utilize a lot of mushrooms for medicinal purposes. They would usually do long tea simmers, like I mentioned before, which are amazing and always, delicious. But now with a lot of research into compounds, usually what you'll see is what's called double extractions. It's usually in the form of a tincture. These are usually what I recommend to people because they're easy to take. Before I say that though, to answer the person's question about eating, cooking mushrooms isn't going to get rid of those compounds. It's not going to break them down or harm them. But you do need to eat a lot of those mushrooms in order to reap the same medicinal benefits that are talked about in a lot of these, in a lot of this research. So a lot of people will go to supplements that have a lot more mushrooms in a tiny amount of space, and that's how these double extractions will do it. So in order to get the full spectrum of chemicals that are medicinal in fungi, you need to extract with water and heat and with alcohol, because some of the compounds are water soluble and other compounds are alcohol soluble. So if you just do a tea simmer, you do get some medicinal compounds, but you don't get the full spectrum because some things won't pull from the mushrooms in the water, if that makes sense. So in a tincture, usually, the process would be like you'd have your reishi or your turkey tail, you'd put some in alcohol, the alcohol would pull out different properties. And then when that alcohol was done pulling, usually takes about a month, then you would take some more, turkey tail or reishi or whatever you used, and you would do the same long simmer tea that I mentioned before. And you would add those two compounds together, and what you're left with is a really, really complex supplement or tincture that has it's like the equivalent of even eating, pounds and pounds of mushrooms, but all down into just a couple drops that you need to take a day. So if anyone's looking for a local source, I always like to rep Hawk Meadow Farm in Trumansburg. I did work for them for multiple years, so that sounds biased, but they grow all of their mushrooms outside. They do things all the right way. In my time working there for multiple years, we heard just some amazing stories of healing that people told us from all sorts of different ailments, because the products that they make are really good and high quality. So I'd always recommend them for anyone who's interested. But there are a lot of really amazing companies out there. You just have to find the right ones and tease out the people that aren't as good.
Yeah, and find something that works for you, too. And I know with cancer patients, sometimes there is worry around tinctures because they are typically about 20%, 25% alcohol. You typically only need about 1 to 3 milliliters total per day for like a proper dose. There are also some other companies out there that are making them into gummies as well, or as a glycerin, so it's alcohol free. And the thing with that is, just do your due diligence and really try to make sure that they're going to be using fruiting bodies at the very least.
Yeah, and before we move on to the next subject, I just also want to say that, none of this is exhaustive. There are tons and tons of other species that have been researched that people are looking into, lots of other different, compounds, and this is changing every single day. So like I said, do your own research, talk to your doctor, read some of these articles online. It really is amazing what's being found. And there's lots of other species, more than I talked about. So yeah, do your research.
And ask people you trust.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, we're frozen. We're on the chat, I think. You gotta click into the, there we go. Yeah, so fantastic fungi, fantastic movie. If you guys haven't seen it, I think it really is responsible for a lot of the recent shroom boom, if you will. And then a book that I really like to recommend to anybody suffering with any type of mental ailments, anxiety, depression, PTSD, is Michael Pollan, a very fantastic writer, incredible with words. He somehow is able to take an experience that's impossible to describe and write an entire book about it. So if you have the time, I know he also has an audiobook that is, he reads as well, and he has a fantastic voice, and he is really great about pacing everything through. So if you don't have the time to pick up a book and really read through it, the audiobook is also very accessible, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, and How to Change Your Mind is on Netflix. I haven't watched it yet. I've heard many great things. So that series I would also recommend. I believe there's only one episode on mushrooms, but there are, many episodes that touch on many different things in there. So again, I cannot recommend that book enough. It's the best book on the subject currently out, and I've given away many copies. I've read it a couple times. It's just really fantastic, and it really goes into a lot of the science, if that's kind of more of your forte, but it keeps it light enough that it's an enjoyable read. And then you have all of the citations in the book, so if you really want to dig into a particular thing, it's very accessible for you to do so.
Yeah, so both of these things, they came out around the same time, this book and this documentary. And yeah, as Zach said, I really think that they're both largely responsible for the culture suddenly getting interested in psychoactive mushrooms, as well as just general foraging and mushroom topics.
All right. So psilocybin and end-of-life depression. So there are a handful of studies done in the 1970s. Unfortunately, they kind of all have been pushed under the rug for one reason or another. The 70s is when the war on drugs really kind of took off. Many people like to call it the war on freedom of consciousness. The biggest thing around the studies from the 70s is none of them were double blind. So everyone kind of knew what they were getting. The treaters knew, the people getting that knew. And in the realm of science, that is kind of a no-no. So there was some promising findings from that, particularly around people that had a lot of anxiety or just angst and heaviness around terminal illness. And what a lot of them found, and while none of it's conclusive because of the things that I just outlined, is that these psychedelic compounds have a way of really kind of targeting end-of-life depression specifically. It's good. It's good for depression and anxiety in general, but what the 70s studies found is that it really helped with people that were dealing with the heaviness and uncertainty of what's to come next. Fast forward 40 years, nothing kind of happened in between. It was very hush hush. Psychedelics were kind of very alt culture. If you brought them up in any type of scientific setting, whether, even if it was psychiatry or psychology, you were kind of laughed out of the room. So this recent boom has kind of really helped get things back to get the ball rolling again with the studies. So I think it was around 2014 that Johns Hopkins University started dealing with, they were kind of the first university that was willing and able to start doing more of these studies. And they're all very controlled, they're all kind of done in the same building with a group of highly trained psychiatrists. They use a synthesized form of psilocybin, which is the psychedelic compound one of, I guess, the psychedelic compounds in psychedelic mushrooms. It's an alkaloid, so it's very bitter, as the mushrooms are also rather bitter, but so they use a synthesized version of psilocybin in a controlled room, and setting is very important. So How to Change Your Mind will really go into depth in a lot of the studies, but how they're set up and how they're conducted. But the one round of them was done where they gave a very heavy dose after, weaning out people and kind of in a psychiatry type setting. They would get to really what people were feeling, how they were feeling about it, what was going on. And all of these people were, diagnosed with terminal illness. And so they'd give them a very heavy dose at the first meeting, and these individuals would be in a room. They'd be in a very comfy chair. They'd have very comfy headphones on, and also blinders up as well, like some sort of sleeping mask or something. And the idea behind that is to put you into a state of deprivation of your other senses. And what that would help do is really turn the whole focus of the psychedelic session inward. So there's a lot that goes on in your brain during a psychedelic experience. There's some cute little charts on how to change your mind that will talk about it. But it helps turn off your default neuromode network and really kind of encourage neuroplasticity. Sorry, I got distracted by a chat there. So it helps rewire some of your brain circuitry. And so if you think of like your brain and your like everyday life as just kind of like a hill, like a snow mountain or something, you have paths that you've cut through, like every morning you do kind of the same thing, or like you look at the same tree and it's, it's just a tree. Your brain, you don't really perceive reality as it is. Your brain has a way of kind of shortcutting everything to make things easier for you. If you can think back to when you were a kid and you were just like in awe of everything around you, that's your brain learning. And then what it does from there is it tries to make things more efficiently, because it's very calorically intensive for your brain to operate that way. And so, if you think of how to survive, if every time you go for a walk through the woods, it takes you 45 minutes just to go half a mile or so, because you're just like so enamored by everything around you, it's all so new, your brain's going to try to short circuit that a little bit and make some shortcuts. And what psilocybin and other psychedelics have been shown to kind of help with is going back to that snow analogy, is if you have all of these paths cut through, and so every time you see something, you take that path straight down to the bottom, you understand what it is. Having one of these very intense psychedelic experiences basically like recoats that whole mountain with new snow. So maybe those paths are still under there somewhere, and maybe if you'll get back right into that same setting, but probably what's been found is probably not. Typically what happens is you in the first 3 to 4 weeks after, there's this like really profound glow around individuals who have done this study. And this typically lasts around 6 to 8 months after just one single dose. And that's kind of on the low end. Some people are good for a couple of years, but with these terminally ill patients, it's typically found around 6 to 8 months. So in these studies, it's usually at the 6-month mark that they have another session, and they'll have another dose. And then it's found that the second session typically prolongs that experience for another year. So you're talking about 2 sessions, 6 months apart, and a year and a half of relief. And so what's been kind of found in a lot of these studies is even with treatment-resistant depression, which I know some cancer patients who are really struggling with getting about their day-to-day with this overlooming diagnosis on them, have a hard time functioning, have a hard time living, have a hard time with a will to live. And psilocybin has found to kind of help people accept that and not necessarily like move on, but move forward. And they're able to really enjoy the last bits of their life. They're, a lot of times it's found that people kind of beat their end date where, maybe a doctor says you have 3 months to live. Then you have this really profound experience. You see everything with kind of a new light again, and you're able to live your life happily, even though you may not have a long time left to live, and that, but a lot of people have come to accept it. A lot of these, they do reports after the trips too about how people are feeling, what they kind of saw, what they experienced. And a lot of people just talk about acceptance and how hard it was for them before that moment. But this psilocybin was able to kind of direct these people into an acceptance of death rather than this like refusal to go against it. So then that helps people's, mindset is kind of everything. So it helps people realize that they have something to live for, even if it's just living happily for what little time they have left. Even if you're someone with maybe no family or people around you, even those types of individuals have been found to get this acceptance, and they're able to kind of move forward and continue living and live a good life for what time they have left. And it's typically found that they're typically living longer than what was predicted for them, which is just really amazing. So I have a couple of things on here, set and setting. That is really like where you're doing this. And all of these are done with licensed professionals in a sanctioned environment. So set and setting is probably the most important thing, outside of the substance itself. If you kind of have to go into it knowing that things are going to be very different for 5 hours or so. Your perception of reality is not going to be the same for those 5 hours. A lot of people think like psychedelics and they immediately think like hallucinations and they're going to see dragons or like the things are going to come out of the walls. And that's like not so much what it is, especially in these settings where you're blindfolded. Michael Pollan does a really good job talking about a couple of his trip journeys in the book, but it's really about inner reflection, coming to terms with some things that you've maybe been running from. So it can be uncomfortable during the experience. It's not like this really fun roller coaster ride, but it is a roller coaster ride in a sense. But a lot of people end up, kind of meeting with their demons in this altered sense of consciousness. And the most important thing is to not run away. And that's what these psychiatrists are typically there for, these therapists are there for, is you come up against something and maybe you can say a couple words to them and they can maybe change the music that you're listening to, or they can like say a little mantra or help you kind of sit with what you're facing rather than run away. Because if you run away, it will only continue to chase you. And so what a lot of these people document in their post-trip experiences is that I had a period of uncomfort during my experience, but that uncomfort left me with a lightness afterwards because I was able to sit there, in a lot of cases with individuals with terminal illness, they're able to sit there with death really and kind of accept what's to come. And then from there, they're able to just, live their life again almost as if they don't have the terminal illness, even though they still are very fully aware that they do, but that it's just not weighing them down so much anymore. And so the last little bit here, a few years ago, the FDA went over the Right to Try Act. And so I know a lot of people with terminal illnesses are familiar with this, and it's very often, I think, kind of skewed towards like experimental drugs for treatment, for maybe reducing your cancer size or slowing its growth. But it's also included for psychedelics as well. And the avenues might be a little convoluted as to how to get around to having a sanctioned experiment, having a sanctioned trip with an individual outside of one of these studies. I mean, more of these studies are kind of popping up every day. So if you can get into one of those, that would be really fantastic. But if you don't have the gumption or the ability to be able to do that, you still have this right to try, where you may be able to go through legal avenues in order to secure an experience like this, or at least maybe take away some of the fears around if you were able to happen upon some of these substances yourself. You do know that you have the right to try these things and kind of experiment with your consciousness a little bit and maybe find the healing. And my recommendation for anyone that would be thinking about that is know who you're going to be doing this with. Like if you have a therapist or a psychiatrist that you really trust, or I would really recommend trying to be with a therapist or a psychiatrist or a social worker or someone licensed who's able to kind of help you through that experience. The last thing you want to do is do something like this alone in your room, scared, and then, because it can be very uncomfortable. It's a totally altered state of consciousness. The world is not the way you see it. And these substances really kind of peel back the curtain a little bit and really change your brain chemistry for those 4.5, 5 hours. So I would just recommend, set and setting, know who you're doing it with, know what you're doing, and go into it with a very open mind.
Yeah. And to just end after that more heavy subject, we always just like to remind people, don't forget that just being out in nature in and of itself can be really, really healing for your mind. There have been countless studies out there about concepts like forest bathing or similar, where you see individuals who spend time outside, or even just like for certain studies like staring at a tree. It increases your desire to be kind, and lowers anxiety. It can help lower depression. It can help make you feel happier. And fungi are an amazing way to kind of engage with nature, because there's so many out there. They're just so lovely. There's so much to explore. They really get you, on the ground, like looking and excited. And I think fungi just existing in nature in and of itself can have, provide their own source of healing. So that is all we have.
Yeah, I think we'll open the floor to questions.
We'll open the floor to questions. I'm just going to stop sharing so and see everyone again. Hello, and I see there is one question. Recommendations on sources for tea with mushrooms. There are a lot of, like I said, lots of companies out there. Tea is a little easier because there's lots of places out there that sell dried mushrooms. What's the big company out there that sells dried herbs?
Rose.
Mountain Rose. Yeah, if you any place that sells dried herbs, usually you can find dried mushrooms on their website.
An Asian market typically
too. Lots
will
of
have
Asian
large
markets.
bags of very fairly priced dried mushrooms.
You don't necessarily have to worry as much about the myceliated grain versus fruiting bodies in teas, because you can actually see that it's it's like the mushroom itself. So lots of sources online for that. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, that's a great.
Yeah, that is a good one. So I don't know of any. So the question, if anyone doesn't have the chat open, is just about interactions between mushroom supplements and antidepressants. So I don't know as far as like the strictly medicinal mushrooms go, but I know as far as psilocybin is concerned, it's typically discouraged to use mushrooms and be on any type of antidepressant, whether typically SSRIs or SSNRIs are the ones that are discouraged. The fear could be about how they interact together. I don't think there's any conclusive evidence on negative side effects, but I know that all of the studies that have been done are done on people that are not on antidepressants. I don't know. I unfortunately do not remember the exact problems around the concerns with psilocybin and SSRIs, but I know that there is a concern there. So I would say just be very open with your healthcare provider if that is something that you're kind of looking to experiment with or try out.
Yeah, and as far as the other medicinal species go, that is part of what makes the studies of medicinal mushrooms really exciting in the medical world, is because in all of this research, most of these species really don't have any negative side effects. The only one that I've ever seen was a study done on chaga that showed that really, really, really high doses of chaga over a long time, I think affected your liver, kidneys, kidney stones. That's what it was. And that's, as far as I have read, the only example of negative side effects from medicinal mushrooms.
So I see Sue asking about growing mushrooms on a toilet paper roll. Yes, that is something that we actually do at our house pretty frequently. Against Emma's best wishes sometimes. I'm a bit of a squirrel, so I collect a lot of things. One of those things is wild mushrooms. We have a little bit of a lab set up for sterile work, but sometimes not sterile work is really more fun. So the mushroom that I know that works the best with any type of cardboard is oyster mushrooms.
Yeah.
Very prolific in the wild. Yeah, and Steve Gabriel, Wellspring Forest Farm, they do a mushroom CSA, a lot of oyster mushrooms in there. I call it the butt of the mushroom, but the little bit at the end that you usually chop off and a lot of people throw away or throw into their compost. If you just wet some cardboard, I typically recommend hot water for a kind of pasteurization. But if you wet that cardboard and then just give it a little squeeze so it's not sopping wet, and then just roll any part of that discard oyster mushroom into that cardboard, and then put it into like a deli container or a little piece of Tupperware or even a Ziploc baggie, it will grow and it will produce mushrooms.
Yeah, you could open it up every couple of days and see the mycelium starting to take. And oyster is really the main one for that. There's a huge spectrum for cultivating mushrooms. Some are very, very picky and require a lot of effort. Some of them can't be cultivated at all. You could only forage them. Those are usually the more expensive mushrooms. But things like Stropharia, which are wine caps, or oysters, they are very, very aggressively growing mushrooms. And so you could kind of do these more like low tech, like growing experiments. Stropharia are often grown in wood chips in people's gardens, which is a really fun one. You could just like put a little bit of mycelium that you could order online right in your wood chips. And then soon enough, you could be picking wine cap mushrooms for your dinner table.
Don't do as I did though. I started some of these experiments in the house. What I found was that when they start to produce spores, they produce so much of them that I had created a monster. I was afraid that I was going to become allergic to the spores, so I had to clean up my act.
But usually you could just grow some of that mycelium right inside, and then once you see the white fibrous stuff, then take it outside and put it in a pile with some wood chips or some straw, and then they'll take off from there.
So in other mushroom growing kits, it's going to be very similar. If you really want to grow them inside, if that's kind of your only avenue, if you don't have a lot of outdoor space or you're unable to get outside very often, you can get clear plastic tubs and maybe just put a couple holes in the sides and mist it every day or so. But once the mushroom starts to form, pick it when it's still pretty attractive looking. If it gets like oyster mushrooms, they kind of have like this growth where they stay kind of, the cap stays kind of folded over. That's when you want to pick them. They'll start to sporulate a little bit, but once that cap kind of starts to like blow out and kind of like curve up, it's really sporulated a lot. So it's got a lot of spores that it's dumping. We're talking like tens of millions of spores, and they're super tiny, but you've got tens of millions of spores and you've got 15 mushrooms there. And then, you create these issues where your air quality is suffering, and you don't want that. It's not ideal. So mushroom growing kits, I think, are great.
Yeah, they're usually easy to do, easy to find online. Usually like $10 to $15 for a little kit, and you get like a couple flushes of edible mushrooms out of them.
Yeah, and if you're getting something like oysters or wine caps, you get those mushroom growths and you take them and you eat some of them, and then you can propagate the rest of them, and you can kind of keep that cycle going for a while. And there's tons of different substrates that they like to grow on. So with oyster mushrooms, we're coffee drinkers. So what we also do is we take our coffee grounds and we make sure that they're not sopping wet or anything, but then we combine that in with the cardboard and with the oyster butt, or even Stropharia will do pretty well with that as well. And that's a nitrogen source, so they'll grow a lot faster, but they may also be a little more susceptible to contamination. But that's something where, like, if you have a garden and you kind of grew out a little bit of it, then you're like, oh, well, now I can just like dump this right onto my garden, and maybe you mulch with straw or cardboard. And if you do that, and you have any other year besides this past summer where we were in a crazy drought, you'll typically receive some mushrooms from your garden that way as well.
Any other questions?
Okay.
No?
I don't see anything.
All right, well, if anyone thinks of any questions after this, we have a website, just maidenhairmushrooms.com. We have an email on the website, so feel free to shoot us an email. We also, in the springtime, will do more walks and classes and all that jazz.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma and Zach, for all the information, for joining us. I will be sure to share your website with everyone. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone for coming, for having us. Have a good rest of your night.
Thanks everybody. Take care.
Bye.